I'd like to start just by introducing our speaker and welcoming everyone. Thanks everyone so much for joining us. This is our third CAIS seminar this semester. We are so lucky actually to have Rediet Abebe. I'm so grateful that she accepted to be one of our speakers. Rediet is a junior fellow at Harvard Society of Fellows. She's also an incoming assistant professor of computer science at the University of California, Berkeley. She holds a PhD in computer science from Cornell and graduate degrees in math from Harvard and the University of Cambridge. She's the first Black woman to receive a PhD in computer science from Cornell. Her research is in AI and algorithms with a focus on equity and justice. Dr. Abebe is a co-founder and co-organizer of the multi-institutional interdisciplinary research initiative Mechanism Design for Social Good. Her dissertation received the 2020 ACM SIG-KDD Dissertation Award for offering the foundations of this emerging research area. Abebe's work has informed policy and practice at the National Institutes of Health and the Ethiopian Ministry of Education. She has been honored in the MIT Technology Review's 35 Innovators Under 35 and the Bloomberg 50 list as one to watch. She's also co-founder of Black in AI, a nonprofit organization tackling representation issues in AI. Her research is influenced by her upbringing in her hometown of Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. We're so happy to have you, Rediet. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Phoebe. Thank you. Yay, very good. Thank you, Phoebe and Ty and Haley for organizing this. I'm really sad that I'm not able to be there physically, but I will look forward to visiting USC as soon as that becomes feasible. And I really appreciate you all for inviting me. It's USC is an institution where I've been following a lot of work coming out of computer science and operations research, but also at the School of Social Work. It's an important institution. There's a lot of important work that's come out of there that has influenced my work. So it's really an honor for me to be here, even if it's virtual. So today I'll talk to you about one work that is already published, and then the second work that's sort of ongoing, but I would really love to share and get folks' thoughts on it. But first, I just want to confirm: is the slide advancing? Can you see? Oh, wait, am I not sure? I'm not sharing my screen. Let me share my screen. Oh, host disabled participant screen sharing. I think you have to enable. And is it letting me? Okay, very good. So I'm going to share my screen and just confirm. Did it advance now? Okay, very good. Good. All right. So I was mentioning that I'm going to talk about two projects, one of which is more on the theoretical side and is already published, but a second one that's ongoing, but I think is going to be of interest, especially to the folks in the School of Social Work. So I'm very happy to share it with you all today. So as you all know, and I think now it's becoming even more apparent, poverty is a significant problem in the United States. It's highly prevalent. So for instance, in Boston, where I'm currently based, we know that over 1 in 5 of the population is living in poverty by some measures. And in other parts of the country, it's even worse. LA, where maybe many folks are based, is another part of the US where there's high rates of poverty. And despite its prevalence, we know that poverty is really difficult to measure. So oftentimes what we end up doing is we rely on simple measurements of poverty like people's income or their wealth. And then we use those simple measures to make these highly consequential decisions about what assistance families are going to get, right? And at the same time, there's a lot of empirical and policy and social work research and policy that shows that these simple measurements are actually simply inefficient. So for instance, there's a report by the Poverty Tracker Study, which is the study that came out of the Columbia Population Research Center, that says that they did this extensive study and they had these reports, and one of the quotes that really stood out to me was it said official income only measurements of poverty painted a picture that was too optimistic and didn't actually capture the full magnitude of disadvantage that families might be facing. And this is a study that was based in New York City, but there's many, many others that show this to be true in other parts of the US and indeed other parts of the world. And so you might ask, okay, well, we often use these simple measurements, but you're saying that there's a lot of work that shows that poverty is more complicated. What exactly are we missing? What aspects, what facets of economic disadvantage are we missing here that wouldn't be captured by these sort of very simple measurements? And you might ask also, if we had more sophisticated measurements, then how would we actually use those to make allocation decisions, for instance, or other policy? And reflecting on that, actually, there's one missing dimension of poverty that is very well studied. And I think now, especially, we're starting to feel this being even more relevant, which is people experiencing different types of income shocks, right? So income shocks can be things like an unexpected expense. So it could be that you get a parking ticket, or it could be that someone in your family gets sick, right? So that's an unexpected expense. Or it could be that there's some sort of delay in your income flow. So maybe you have a sort of interruption in your employment. Maybe it's just that your check got there delayed, right? So these are sort of like families have an expected flow of income, and that might be interrupted either because they didn't get their income, or because they had an unexpected expense. And income shocks are known to play a significant role. So one place where they play a really significant role is related to housing stability and homelessness. So here you see this picture. It's one of my favorite pictures. It was taken by Sally Ryan photography, and it's a picture of a woman named Ara Sparkman, and she at the time was living in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. This was about 10 years ago. And you see her pictured here in February in 2010, I believe, right after she'd been evicted from her home, right? And so her name is Ara Sparkman. Ara Sparkman's story is one story that kind of was brought to light because of work by sociologist Matt Desmond, where he and his collaborators show that sort of unexpected shocks to your income can actually start these cycles of poverty that can lead to eviction, right? So in his work, he shows this complicated relationship that income shocks have with health, but it's with housing. But it's not just housing. There's many other aspects where income shocks play a role. Health is one, education is one, general welfare is one. And so people, especially in economics and sociology and social work, have really studied the role of income shocks for decades and decades, right? So there's some citations here that you can look at, but really this is like a vast body of work. And despite their prevalence, we still haven't actually thought about them on my side of research and academia, which is computer science and modeling, right? We haven't really thought about how to better model income shocks to come up with potentially better measurements of economic welfare. And once we do, also, we still have to think about how that might change how we might allocate different types of assistance programs like government subsidies that we might give out. And so this is precisely a question that we tackled with my collaborators, John Kleinberg and Matt Weinberg. We asked, we know that shocks are important. How can we incorporate them into measurements of economic welfare? And then once we've done that, how can we use these new models to inform allocation of different types of subsidies? So for this work, we started with a very stylized model that's based on the structure of ruined processes, and it goes as follows. So you imagine that you have N agents. These are, you can think of these as families, right? And you're a planner. So as a planner, you can give out, some sort of assistance, right? And you're assuming that here the x-axis is time. Time is running continuously in this case, and the y-axis is the agent's reserve. And so for each agent, we'll assume now that they have an initial wealth of U sub I. So this can vary by agent, right? So this is, you can think of this as like, say, what they have in their savings account combined and all their assets and everything combined, right? So this is what they have as their initial wealth. And they have a net income flow of C sub I, right? So this is how much they would earn on average minus how much they would have sort of in expense. So that this is what they would have kind of left over. And under this setting, their reserve is very straightforward to calculate, right? You have at time t, their reserve R sub I is going to be what their initial reserve is, which is their wealth, plus what their income is times t, right? So this is just if nothing was happening, every month, their income flow was as expected and their expense was as expected. They just keep kind of piling onto their reserve and they would have this much reserve left. But now we're in a setting where we're assuming that there's some sort of shocks that families are experiencing, right? So you can imagine these shocks as these like sudden dips in the reserve, and these like sort of sudden drops. And we'll assume that these shocks are sort of arriving at randomly selected discrete time points, T1, T2, T3, and so on. And when the shock arrives, we'll assume that it has different magnitudes. So the magnitude will be indicated by S sub I. So S sub I of 1 is the first shock that they experience. It has that magnitude, and you keep going, right? And so here you can see that the first shock was bigger than the second shock, but it's smaller than the third shock that you see here, right? These drops vary in magnitude. And so now in this setting, the reserve changes by a little bit, right? Where you have is that at time t, the agent's reserve is what their reserve would have been if there was no shocks, right? So these two terms that you see, the U sub I plus their income times t. And then you have to subtract all the, the total magnitude of shocks that they've experienced up until that time t, right? So you're just summing over the total magnitude of shocks. So now you have this different reserve that's incorporating shocks. If there are any questions, I should say, feel free to jump in. I can't see the chats, but I can hear. So I'm happy to stop to answer any questions if anything is unclear. And so now we have these shocks, so we have this reserve. And we'll make the following assumption that we'll actually be able to drop later, but for now we'll assume also that that these shocks have a Poisson arrival, and each agent can have a different arrival rate. So the beta sub I will indicate the arrival rate that the agent is experiencing here, right? So you could have families that are experiencing shocks very frequently, and other families that are experiencing them potentially less frequently. And once you experience once you experience a shock, the magnitude is going to be drawn also from a distribution F sub I that's also specific to families. So what this means is that different agents can experience different frequencies of shocks, but they can also be experiencing different magnitudes of shocks. So you can have a family that experiences frequent shocks, but maybe they're on average quite small. And you can have a different family that experiences them not so frequently, but maybe when they happen, they're very big. So you can think of this as like a huge medical expense or something like this, right? So here's our, very stylized model that we have here. And what we're really interested in, and this is informed by a lot of the housing instability work, is making sure that families don't fall below a specific threshold that makes them very susceptible, right? So we're imagining here that there's some threshold which will set to be 0, and we'll say that this is like the ruin threshold. So if you fall below this threshold at any given time t, you've now become very susceptible to potentially job loss or eviction or poor health, right? So we're going to assume that once you've fallen below this line, it's going to be much, much harder to get you out of it than to prevent you from falling below this line to begin with, right? And so there's maybe some efficiency considerations here, but also just we don't want people to be evicted. We don't want people to experience poor health, right? And so we really want to make sure that everyone is above this line at all times. And so now this setup, which is quite stylized, already gives us like a really rich set of optimization questions that we could ask here. Because what we have here is, if you don't want people to fall below this threshold, you can think of that as like a ruin probability. You don't want them to experience ruin. We're working in infinite horizon, by the way. And so really what we're interested in is the probability that a family experiences ruin. And this function, this ruin probability is a function of the family's income, the family's initial wealth, the arrival rate of the shocks, which is the B sub I, and the distribution from which the shocks are drawn, right? So we have these four parameters that are factoring into families' ruin probabilities, and that's what we're really interested in this space. And so now you can imagine as a planner, you have different levers that you can pull here. One of these could be that maybe you have a budget of income subsidies that you can give out, and you have to make a decision about how much income subsidy you're giving out at each time step. And so what this income subsidy does is it takes the agent's income C sub I and it just adds the X sub I. And so here you see the graph that has like the dotted line and then the solid line. And so when you give them the income subsidy, you can imagine that you've changed the slope, right? And so maybe actually this income subsidy was enough to ensure that the family does not fall below the ruin threshold during this time frame that you see on the graph here. And so as a planner, you have a fixed budget, B, and you have you can give out income subsidies X sub I such that you're subject to this budget constraint, and you can optimize for any number of things. So one of the things that you could imagine optimizing for is a min-sum objective, which basically says that you're trying to minimize the expected number of people that experience ruin i.e. you're trying to minimize the sum of the ruin probabilities here, right? So you're imagining that you're an agent, you're a planner, you have your budget of income subsidies that you can give out, and you're trying to make sure that the least number of people, say, experience eviction, right? So this is one objective. There's many others you can consider, but we'll start with this one. So this already is an interesting optimization question that we can look at, right? We can ask, how can we optimally allocate these income subsidies, which is the intervention that we're looking at, to optimize for this objective function. And also, we're not just interested in solving this optimally, we're also interested in seeing whether this gives us any insights into the sort of the nature of economic welfare. And so to consider that, we look at a very special case, and which already kind of provides us a lot of levers here. We look at the case where the agents have no initial wealth. So you can see here that at time 0, the agent's reserve is 0. So one way to think about this is that this could be families that are kind of living paycheck to paycheck. They don't really have a lot of buffer to rely on, right? So they're sort of really starting at this like very dangerous zone. And we also assume positive drift, meaning that on average, we assume that families are kind of trending up. So the income that they have at their disposal is more than sort of the expected size of shock that they would experience at any time point, right? So if you sort of left them alone, it's not certain that they will experience ruin. Whereas if they had negative drift, it means that on average, their reserve is going down. So almost surely they're going to experience ruin. So that's not the case. We're looking at families that are on average kind of trending up, but they might still experience ruin. And so we also actually make a further assumption here. We'll say that this distribution F sub I, the distribution from which I'm drawing these shocks, can look like any number of funny things. I'm only going to assume that I know what the mean of this distribution is, which I'll denote by mu sub I. And we'll also assume that this distribution has finite mean and variance, and that's it, right? So this is sort of like the simplest assumption that we could sort of think of in the setting. And already here, probabilists have done a lot of the heavy lifting for us. Turns out there's a simple expression for the ruin probability here under these assumptions, which says that if you have positive drift, you have these assumptions on the distribution from which I'm drawing these shocks, and the families have 0 initial wealth, then their ruin probability is given by this expression where the numerator is giving you the expected size of shocks that they would experience, and then the denominator is their income, right? So this is a very simple expression that we have at our disposal. So, okay, so that's great. We have a simple expression for families' ruin probabilities. We can come back to our original optimization problem, which says that I'm a planner, I have a budget for income subsidies. I want to give that out in such a way that I'm minimizing the expected number of families that experience ruin, meaning that I'm trying to minimize the sum of the ruin probabilities. And I can rewrite the ruin probabilities using the expression from the previous slide. So the setup is quite straightforward, right? We're able to do a lot with it because we're trying to minimize this objective. We're trying to minimize this fee that you see here. What you can do is you can look at the partial derivative of this function phi with respect to the x sub I, which are the income subsidies that you're giving out. And you take this expression that you see here as the first derivative. If you take the second derivative, you can see that this phi is strictly convex because the second derivative with respect to x sub I is always positive. And so what that says is that the optimal solution here can be obtained just using like a greedy algorithm that proceeds as follows. So basically what the algorithm will do is it will take the agents and order them in increasing order of these like partial values, these first derivatives that you see here, right? So agent 1 has like the most negative value, agent 2 has the second most negative, and so on. It keeps going up. So you have 6 agents in this setting, right? And then what you'll do with your income subsidy is first you'll give the first agent an income subsidy x sub I up until the point where their partial value matches that of agent 2. Then you give subsidies to agent 1 and agent 2 together simultaneously up until the point where their partial value matches that of agent 3. And you keep going, and either you assist everyone or maybe you run out of a budget, right? So this is sort of like a very straightforward greedy algorithm that allows you to obtain the optimal solution in this highly constrained stylized setting, right? And so one thing that's kind of, actually, I just want to pause here, make sure that this kind of makes sense. The virtual nature of these things makes it hard to gather.
Yeah, we do have a question from Ara Rediet.
Oh, go ahead.
So let me read it. One question I have is, what impact does the fact that 25% of Americans have no savings, i.e. reserve, and 70% of Americans have less than 1,000?
What impact does that have?
Right.
Yeah, that's such a great question. Yeah, so that's basically what I was sort of hinting at when I said this, like we have our optimization problem, which is more general, but in the stylized setting, in this special case setting, we were looking at the case with zero initial wealth, and that's precisely motivated by what you're saying, right? There's a lot of families that have no safety net, and so they're really starting at this like danger zone already, just one parking ticket, and there's a lot of empirical work that shows this. There's like one parking ticket can essentially start a cycle of poverty that becomes impossible to dig out of without significant assistance. So that's, even though sort of mathematically this is a highly constrained assumption that we're making, when you map it back to poverty issues in the US, this is actually not very constrained. Like a lot of families are living paycheck to paycheck. Mm-hmm. Yeah, very important consideration.
Thank you. I actually also have a question, and perhaps more people can as well type. I was wondering, there's several parameters in this problem which, are going to impact very much the solution. And I wonder, so is this information that's available? Are you asking from people to give that information? How does that?
Yeah, so we're going to talk more about that towards the end, but yes, so there is, So estimating these parameters is itself a very, very hard question, and it's something that we're starting to grapple with, but we are by no means going to be the first or last, right? Because each of these is like even income, right? Which I've mentioned to you earlier, it's a simple measure of welfare that we use, but even income is really difficult to measure, right? What do you include in people's income? Do you include sort of more ad hoc work? How do you even include it? Like, do you ask people and then you trust that they tell you? Because people forget what their income is, or who do you include in people's income? Do you include the whole family? Do you include, say, like if you have a child who's under 18 and they're working and their income is contributing to your income, to your household income, does that count? There's so many, even these like these measures that we can easily take for granted are very hard to get at. And these other things that I'm assuming, like the arrival rate of shocks or the distribution of shocks, that's so much more complicated. What is even a shock, right? How can you enumerate all of these things? So I'll give you a couple of slides on the more applied work that we're doing now that will get us some of these questions, but lower your expectations. This is an area where many of us need to contribute because it's really, really hard. Yeah,
very interesting. Thanks.
But let's go with the setting where we're like assuming a lot of things away, right? And even then we're going to come up with a lot of really interesting observations, right? We're just assuming that we know what these parameters are. We don't have to worry about them. And even then you have this kind of interesting thing that's happening in this constraint setting, right? Where you have, I just told you, this optimization problem can be solved using a greedy water filling algorithm. And even there, you can see that you're prioritizing agents by this partial value, right? So you're saying agent one should be the person who has the most negative value, agent two should be the person who has the second most negative value, and so on, right? And you might ask, okay, so you're using this as a priority index for your optimal solution. That's what your solution is telling you. But maybe this is the exact same thing as ordering people by their income, right? You have this other expression, but maybe that's just saying, just order people from least income to most income, and it would give you the exact same thing, right? And as it turns out, it's actually not the case. And in fact, these priority indices by income, which is what we would use in assistance programs, versus our priority index, which is the optimal thing to do in our particular setting, can actually give you the exact reverse ordering of people. It can actually say that you can be in a setting where, let's say if you set up the income to be 1 plus I times epsilon, right? Agent one will be the person who has the least income, and agent n will be the person who has the most income. But actually the expression that I showed you in the previous slide would say agent n is the most vulnerable. So like maybe it's the case that they have a slightly higher income than the other agents, but maybe that the shocks that they're experiencing make them significantly more vulnerable. So I can give you a very simple example here that you can see here that shows you that an assistance program that uses just their income versus an assistance program that uses these parameters around shocks can be doing the exact opposite thing, right? So already in this very simple setting, we already have this result that surprised me. And the surprise doesn't actually the surprise doesn't stop there. We find that there's like actually a pretty big gap between our optimal algorithm and any algorithm that uses only income, right? So this is like a pretty, strong result here that says there's like a pretty wide divide between these different measures that you might use. But then it also continues, right? So we looked at also, for instance, we looked at the min-sum objective, right? We were trying to minimize the expected number of people that experience room, but there's many other objectives that you could use. Min-max is one that people think of, right? Where it says that rather than trying to kind of do this expected number, we can instead look at the agent that has the highest ruin probability and try to assist them, right? So it's a sort of like you're trying to kind of like increase the sort of the floor here, right? Trying to make that as high as possible. And in that setting, again, the optimization problem ends up being reasonably straightforward, but it ends up having the same structure where you're again prioritizing agents by some index. And as it turns out, again, these two indices can actually be the exact reverse. So I can optimally solve for the min-sum objective, optimally solve for the min-max objective, and yet actually the solutions for these two things can tell you to target entirely different sets of people, right? So, and this is like a very simple example, actually the same example as before, that gives you this exact same result, right? And then the final thing that we looked at here in this, again, this sort of special example was what kinds of subsidies you can give out, right? So we looked at this income subsidy, which is saying like each month or each time period, I'm coming and giving you some amount of money, but you could instead assume you have a wealth subsidy, which says that I have a fixed budget and in the beginning, I'll give you, an upfront, I'll give you like a lot of money upfront and then I just walk away, right? So that's kind of increasing your the y-intercept rather than kind of, increasing the slope, which is what we saw, right? And in that setting, again, you can ask same question, right? Wealth subsidy, min-sum objective. You have all this information about the families that you used for the income case. What happens? Turns out, again, those priority indices can be the reverses of one another, right? So even after you fixed what information you're taking about families and you're optimizing for the exact same thing, the min-sum objective, a setting where you're giving people a one-time upfront subsidy versus consistently assisting them at each time step can actually tell you to target different sets of families, right? So some families can be more receptive to wealth subsidies versus income subsidies and vice versa. So, the optimization here is not like the most groundbreaking thing, but I actually think the simplicity of this optimization problem, that we're able to use a lot of these off-the-shelf methods and very simple assumptions to already get at these wide divisions that you're seeing here, is already important, right? Because it says that even in this simple setting, information about families matters. If you're using just income versus experiences with shocks, you can be doing like the opposite of what you should be doing. It says that objective functions matter. A lot of times I think we are very quick to defer delegate the responsibility of setting these objective functions to non-policymakers, people who don't engage in poverty alleviation, because we think, min-sum and max, it's both seem reasonable to me. It doesn't matter so much. Absolutely not. It matters a whole lot, even in this very simple setting. And also it says that the intervention types matter, right? So it's not just enough to say we want to identify what families we should assist. It's actually very important to say what kinds of assistance are we talking about, because that could tell you to go for one set of families versus a different set of families, right? So these societal implications are already kind of coming out from this special case that we've talked about. And we don't stop there. So we looked at like a more general setting. We looked at the special setting earlier, but we looked at a more general setting, asked the same set of questions around optimal allocation of subsidies. In particular, in this general setting, we assume that people can have arbitrary income and wealth. We assume that the shocks can be drawn from like any general distribution. We don't even assume that the distribution has any compact representation. We'll just say that it's given to you in some black box fashion. Can be any number of things, right? So it can be any number of funky distributions. We drop the assumption that you have positive drift, right? So now it means that if you have negative drift, it means that on average you're going down, right? On average, your income is not actually covering the shocks that you would expect to experience at each time step, meaning that your ruin probability is 1. Right? So we're in this very general setting, and we ask the same question around, say, allocating income subsidies to optimize for the min-sum objective. And there, the math gets more interesting here, because what happens is that if an agent has negative drift, meaning that their ruin probability is 1, for a while, you could be giving them an income subsidy, but you wouldn't necessarily see their ruin probability responding to the subsidy, right? Because if you have a highly negative drift and I give you an income subsidy, your drift becomes less negative, but it's still negative. So your ruin probability is going to stay 1. And so it's only when your drift breaks even, right? When your income is breaking even with the expected shocks that you might experience, it's only then that I start to observe a response in your ruin probability to the income subsidies that I might give you, right? So because of this, now you've lost convexity, right? And so you're not able to do the kind of like sort of greedy water filling algorithm to get an optimal solution as we had in the previous case. But we still find that in the setting where this optimization problem is NP hard, we're actually able to give an FP task, a fully polynomial time approximation scheme, to optimize for the min-sum objective. So if there's folks in the audience who are not familiar, this is basically the best that you can expect, right? In these settings where your optimization problem is NP hard, we don't expect to get optimal solutions, but this, you can get pretty close, and this is sort of as close as you can get without making further assumptions on the problem, because we've now dropped all of these assumptions. And I won't go into the proof idea, although I would love to talk about it one-on-one in some of the one-on-one conversations that we're having. But I do think this is kind of like worth mentioning, that even with this sort of like stylized example that we've been working with, there's a lot of really interesting optimization-based questions that could be that could potentially surface a lot of good insights here. And now we kind of return to the roots, right? We talked about the poverty tracker study from the Columbia Population Research Center that had informed a lot of the work that we were doing. And we've been thinking a lot about sort of open directions and open questions, informed both by the theoretical work that I've mentioned, but also some of the empirical and computational stuff, right? So for instance, with the more theoretical stuff, you could think about subsidies that are more dynamic. So if you recall the income subsidy, I said, you have a fixed X sub I for each agent, and then you fix that and you don't get to change it. But you could imagine, for instance, saying, I commit to giving you some income subsidy, but actually I can sort of change that, right? I can sort of observe how families are responding. And maybe once the family is doing well enough, I can just like stop giving them an income subsidy and focus on other families, right? So there's sort of dynamic questions here that are very hard, but I think very potentially very insightful. You could incorporate different aspects of income shocks. Also, you can imagine that here we assume that, if I experience an income shock, it only impacts me, but you can imagine maybe people are on a network. And so maybe when I experience a shock, that impacts my sister and my friend and all that. So there's a lot of interesting theoretical questions. Is there a question that I can answer?
Yeah, there are a couple of questions actually.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So the first one by Josh is asking, Eric's question makes me think of a negative wealth, i.e. debt, and negative income, e.g. interest and fees paid on debt. It might be outside the scope of this presentation, but could that be modeled using these strategies?
Yeah, I think that's also another very interesting question. So we didn't consider debt in our work, although I think negative wealth is fine. I don't think it actually messes up any of the results that I mentioned to you, but you could imagine, right? So you could imagine a setting where, so there's some empirical work that I really like that shows that there's actually a lot of things that show the same thing, but one example that I'll give you is there's one that showed that the cost of a parking ticket is actually not like what the sticker price is, right? So a parking ticket in Boston costs, I think, like $40. I don't know, I don't drive, but let's say it costs $40, right? But actually for different families that can cost, so there's an empirical work that showed that for different families, it can actually cost more. So if you get a parking ticket, you're not able to pay it, you have to go to payday loan, or you have to take time off from work to go pay your parking ticket, or whatever. Any number of things can happen to you as a result of just getting this one parking ticket. And they showed that actually for lower income families, the cost is comparable to about $500 instead of $40. Right? So there's a lot of empirical, like really wonderful empirical work by economists, sociologists, social workers, public policy folks that show that these shocks that we think about, like we think of them as like, okay, how much did your medical expense cost? And that's what I'm going to take. But actually that's false. There's a lot of sort of negative externalities that come out of that. And so I think modeling that is going to be really challenging, but definitely worthwhile. It would change the problem significantly. I think it makes many theoretical questions intractable, just because like calculating these ruin probabilities is already really, really challenging anyway. But But I think worthwhile, definitely well motivated, definitely worthwhile.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. We have one more question by Christina Lerman. She's asking about the current negotiations in DC on income assistance for the unemployed. How do you answer the criticisms people have that income subsidy creates a moral hazard where people change their behavior? For example, in front, will start engaging in more risky behavior that will expose them to greater income shocks.
I appreciate that question. I get that question a lot, and I respond with different levels of vigor, but it's always the same content. I find this to be like one of the biggest disappointments, to be honest with you. I think that a lot of times we treat poverty and people who are in poverty with sort of like disdain and suspicion that we don't treat other people, right? And so when we have like say tax cuts for like higher, like, high and middle income families, we don't say, sorry, if I, allow you to make it easier for you to own a home, maybe you're going to do weird stuff like set your house on fire. So I better just like wait until you earn the home, right? We don't do that. There's a really deep history in the US and elsewhere of treating poverty as like a moral flaw and a moral failure, and therefore treating people with suspicion. There's very little evidence that happens. And actually there's a lot of times where people notice things that they're like, oh, look, see, poor people, when you assist them, they do these bad things, but then they look into it, it actually ends up being a good thing. So one of the things that you notice potentially is like, maybe you give people assistance and their income decreases and you're like, what's happening here? But then you find that actually it's because families were working like 3 jobs and it was like, physically and mentally not sustainable. And so they're working less for their own health and to be with their families more, or situations like where they take time out so that they can now go to night school so that they can earn more in the future, right? So they make a lot of decisions, actually, a lot of families make decisions that are good for them, good for society, good for everyone. And yet it's treated with suspicion. And other times, when it doesn't work so well, it's because there's different types of assistance that we should have given families, right? Like, we treat different difficulties separately, but, if one person is poor and they have a medical condition and they have an addiction and they have whatever, there's all different things that could happen to a person. You actually have to look at that in a holistic way and try to provide different types of assistance rather than saying, I, as a government or a society, have failed to treat this aspect of your life, and I'm going to treat that as your fault, right? And so I feel quite strongly about against what you said, but I think it's worth discussing.
Bistra has a question as well. Which of these extensions are the most critical in terms of realism? Many of them seem highly likely to be true in real data / scenarios. Related, is there data-driven work that confirms which distributions and problem variants you have considered and are most relevant to concrete real-world problems in this space?
It's a very good question. I would love to talk to you more about that when we meet one-on-one. In terms of the extensions that I think are interesting, I really think the dynamic one is super interesting. I also think it's not intractable if someone knows more control theory than I do. So if you do, please let's discuss, right? So I do think that would be interesting, in part because a lot of subsidies are dynamic anyway. We get to revisit them at some fixed interval. And so I would be keen to see what happens in this model. Networks are another one, right? Just assuming that shocks actually impact more than one person. Maybe there's some sort of like diffusion that happens on the network. That would be another one. We know actually a lot of times vulnerable families, low-income families, disadvantaged families tend to structure their networks in such a way that they can try to buffer shocks as best as they can, and also, distribute assistance as best as they can as well. It would be really interesting to see that what happens theoretically. There's others that I think are like, if you assume shocks being dependent, I feel like that's going to be really difficult. I think it's a very well motivated extension. I think mathematically that would end up being very challenging, but worth tackling. Yeah, and then actually, I guess I should have updated the slides, but we have work that was just recently submitted looking at how So in low and middle income countries, people have saving circles that they use for risk pooling. So people, come together in some groups and they put in a fixed amount of cash every month or every week or whatever frequency they've decided on, and then they sort of bid on that, and it just kind of goes in like a circular fashion, right? And that's one way in which actually people respond to provide insurance in settings where there's not formal financial institutions available. So we have some work there, although that was like one paper out of many that should be tackled in this area. So I think that's like another area that's very open. And then for the empirical stuff, I was going to go to the next slide, but if there's one more question, I can answer that and then go to the next slide.
That's it. You can go ahead.
Yeah. So the empirical stuff, this is ongoing work that I'm really passionate about, but it's ongoing work, so there's going to be a lot more happening here than what I'm able to share with you today. So one thing we've been doing is we've been working with the poverty tracker dataset. So this is a dataset that was collected by Columbia Population Research Center and the Robin Hood Foundation, which is this charitable organization that works with many nonprofits in New York City. So they have this data set that has over 2,000 families in New York City. It's longitudinal, so they've been following them over a period of about 3 years. And they have a lot of information about people's official poverty status, but then also questions around material hardship and health, right? So like, have you had difficulties paying for rent or like gas, or like health questions around like, have you experienced significant depression or anxiety? How would you rate your health? Things like that, right? So they have a very a much more holistic measurement of people's welfare, families' welfare, than just their income or wealth or something. And one of the things that they have, which is really incredible, is people's experiences with shock. So they have different types of shocks that they look at, right? So far in the theoretical work, we just assume that the shocks are distinguished by just their magnitude, right? We're just saying like, it arrives when it arrives, and then, I'll just measure the magnitude. But there's many different types of shocks that you could have. So people could experience loss of public benefits, that's a shock. Income decrease is a shock. Medical expense is a shock. Being a victim of a crime is a shock. Relationships ending. There are all these different types of shocks, right? So this data set has people's experiences with shocks, and it's, this is a data set that surveyed people every 3 months. So you get to kind of experience how you get to see how people's experiences change over time. And we were able to ask questions around just predicting poverty, right? If we were just to look at the official poverty status, which is used to make many consequential decisions, you can say, okay, can we predict poverty using these different types of shocks? Can we predict poverty using every other information, like people's age and gender and income and various demographic information, right? So we've been looking at that. And one of the things that has been really interesting to see here is that we know that in spaces where you're trying to predict people's life circumstances, like eviction or poverty, we know that prediction doesn't do so well. This is just like now an established result, which is it's good that we know, right? But you can still look at feature importance. So what we did here is we said, we're going to take all these shocks, we're going to use those to predict poverty. We do about as well as you can do, right? Which is, not great, but you can look at like how these things vary. So one of the things that we did was on the left-hand side, you see the shock importance for all genders. So it says that for all genders, you have so for all genders, you have financial decrease being benefit decrease being like the most important shock, and then the second one is police being stopped by the police. That gives you a lot of predictive ability in terms of predicting shocks. But if you look at only female, then financial decrease, income decrease, and relationships ending end up being those three end up being the sort of the most significant shocks that for predicting poverty. Whereas for male, it seems like being stopped by the police, crime loss, being a victim of a crime, right? So crime-related things seem to be very important here, right? So we were able to sort of look at different questions around, if you have these different types of shocks, how important are each of these in terms of predicting poverty? And then we also looked at what relationships do these shocks also have with one another, right? So here what we're assuming is, let's say that at 3 months, right, I look at a family, and let's say that I only look at families that have experienced loss of public benefits, right? So if I only consider those families, and then I ask, in 6 months, or in 3 months from now, at 6 months, which families are going to experience loss of benefits, major expenses, income decrease, all these different types of shocks. So here, if you look at I don't know if you can see my cursor, but if you look at the the fourth column, right? So the one that starts with 5.1, 1.7, 1.8, and so on, right? That says that basically, if you've experienced a loss of benefits at 3 months, then at 6 months, you're 5 times more likely to experience loss of benefits again. Whereas if you've experienced loss of benefits at 3 months, at 6 months, you're only 1.7 times more likely to experience major expenses. And so these two numbers, especially, right, relationships ending and loss of benefits, it says that it makes you twice as likely to experience a relationship ending, 5 times as likely to experience loss of public benefits. And that ratio kind of actually stays pretty high even at 9 months, right? So at 3 months, I asked you, have you experienced loss of benefits? If you say yes, you're not 4 times as likely to experience loss of benefits at 9 months. And so this is just like one snapshot of the many types of analyses that we did, which shows that different types of shocks actually show this very intricate relationship. We've seen that there are a lot of shocks that co-occur frequently. So like medical expenses and relationships ending tend to appear at the same time. It also shows that there's certain sequences of shocks that are very likely, right? So it says basically, once you've experienced a medical expense is another one. Once you've experienced a medical expense, I should just keep an eye out because you're gonna just keep experiencing it at a much higher rate than the rest of the population. And one thing I want to say here is that, with these types of data sets, this is ongoing work with these types of data sets, it's really difficult to make causal claims. It's observational data. We have no idea why once someone experiences a medical shock, they keep experiencing it. It might be that, it's like causal actually, once I've experienced one kind of medical situation, maybe makes me more likely to experience a different one, or maybe there's something else that's going on that just it's a hidden variable, right? We don't know. But a lot of times in these types of spaces, you're less concerned about making causal claims. Sometimes you just want to know which families are, sort of in danger, so you can do a sort of triage situation, and then maybe later we can sort of try to understand the causal relationships. But I do want to say, though, that these types of analyses, right, like the predictions that I mentioned to you, this kind of like more combinatorial enumeration thing that we're doing in this data set can also help surface hypotheses, right? So we can sort of say, look, we don't know what's going on here, but these two shocks tend to appear together a lot more than we would expect, right? And so maybe this could be a possibility for doing more empirical work in that area to understand the relationship between those shocks. Are there any questions here?
Yes, we have a question by Bistra. She's saying some of these issues are very reminiscent of dynamics/relationships in health issues. Are there some lessons/techniques from health modeling approaches that can be borrowed here?
Yeah, very good question. So we're starting to engage with that a little bit more. Yeah, I completely agree with you. There's a lot of work there, especially the epidemiological literature has like robust strategies for exploring these. We're starting to learn that. I don't yet have like a good answer for you here, but if you check back with me in a few months, maybe I will. Yeah, but yes, I think that's a space that we should definitely try to be learning more from. I agree.
Are there other questions? Feel free to type them in the Q&A box. Right now we don't have any more. I don't know if you have more slides ready.
Yeah, so I was about to wrap up. So I just wanted to conclude by saying, these types of questions, what I would like for you to take away with is not necessarily the particular results that we have here, but rather that there is an opportunity, a space for people like myself who do sort of like discrete optimization, algorithmic thinking, mechanism design, but also like enjoy working with these kinds of data sets to actually partner with domain experts from other spaces, including social work research. Economics is one where I think we have a relatively robust relationship, although even there, I think we could work more with development economists and sort of econometrics folks, a lot of people in economics even, right? So there's an opportunity really for us to sort of bring our different sets of expertise to ask questions that could potentially really impact the lives of historically disadvantaged communities. So I'll say that the Mechanism Design for Social Good initiative, which Phoebe mentioned earlier, is one space that for me has been really generative. So it's a organization that I started with Kira Goldner, who's a postdoc at Columbia University, and I've been co-organizing with Irene Lowe at Stanford MSNE, Ana Andrea Stoica at Columbia CS, and Francisco Marmolejo at Oxford. And actually, as of like this past month, we have one more organizer, Juan Yi Li, who is also at Stanford MSNE. So we've been running this initiative. Every time I give this talk, I have to like update it. So we have over 100 institutions that are represented in some form, people who've given talks in our colloquia, members of working groups, given talks in our workshops, all these different activities that we have. And it's over 30 countries, actually, not just 20, with a significant presence, especially in Latin America and in the African continent, in addition to North America. And we have, not just researchers, but also practitioners. We have a technical workshop. We had a technical workshop series at EC. We now have a tutorial series at EC and Wine and Compass and a bunch of different places. We have online colloquia where we've had many different speakers from different disciplines. We have online working groups that have been going on for, it's going on into the third year, that are very domain specific. So they tackle questions within a specific domain. So for instance, one that I'm a part of is on inequality. So we ask questions specifically about provision of assistance for vulnerable families. And it's been going on for over 2 years now. And it's been generously supported by all these initiatives. And something that we're super excited about is that we're actually, well, this was supposed to happen this fall, but then the pandemic happened. So we're doing it next fall. We're having our technical workshop series has now matured into a conference, an ACM conference. It's going to be in fall 2021 sometime. Call for papers will be coming soon. We will, if physical events are possible, which, who knows when that might be possible. If they're possible, it will be at Columbia, but more likely it's going to be virtual. And it's a much like the initiative, this conference series is something that was created not for the purposes of like doing the hardest technical work, although if that ends up happening, that's always great, but rather creating a space where different types of expertise can actually, really come together and try to do something. And so we accept all different types of submissions. So one of the things that we implemented 2 years ago that I really like is we accept problem pitches. So if you're, let's say, a social worker, working on the ground, you see some issue and you're like, surely there's a better way to do this. I don't know what it is. Maybe these guys will know. You can write that up as like a short 1 or 2 pager that says, here's what the problem is. Here's why it's a problem. Here's why if we solved it, it would be helpful. Here's, some things that other people have attempted, right? So you can submit that as a problem pitch and we would accept that in the same way that we would accept other contributions as well. So we've been working to really engage different types of researchers, but also practitioners in that space, so we can create a generative space for everyone to tackle problems that are of real world importance. And with that, I'll stop. I'll encourage you to go to md4sg.com if you're interested in learning more or signing up for our many activities, which are all online now, but they were for a while. So, ahead of the crowd in that way. So, and I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Guys, feel free again to type up your questions. I actually have one, given that you closed with this, with the Mechanism Design for Social Good slides. I was wondering, what is the best way, I'm sure with your talk, you've inspired all our students to do more work that is like, at the interface of theory and practice, solving important societal problems. How can people get involved, right?
Yeah, there's many ways to do it. So the first thing I'll say is if you go to the website, there's a way that you can just sign up for our email list, and then that way you'll just know everything that's happening and you can jump into whatever works for you. For me, the most helpful thing has been the working groups that I mentioned to you. So we encourage people to sign up for really at most one, just because there's a lot of work that happens there. So we found that it really helps to invest in one working group and just really do a lot of work there. So the inequality group, for instance, in my case, has been, it's been like the backbone of a lot of the work that I do. It's an opportunity to learn from a lot of economists and learn about provision of different types of assistance programs. So that's one way. These meetings happen roughly bi-weekly, although different working groups work differently, and you can kind of like be involved either sort of like at a more surface level where you show up once every 2 weeks and that's that, or you can be really involved, which many people do, where you engage in a research problem and try to work towards that. So that's one way. Another way that there's a huge contingent of people that do this and it works very well is to just attend the annual events, right? So people submit their work is accepted, they show up, they present, they hear from everyone. So that's just sort of like more an annual type of engagement. It really, I know I'm biased, but it really is my favorite event. It's an event where if you just look at like past programs, you'll be able to see that it's like reasonably very well balanced across many disciplines. There's a lot of room for growth, but it's one where I feel like our starting point, our baseline was already quite high. So you will run into people that you are not gonna, I would not have run into in my other conferences that I attend. So that's another way. And honestly, if you have ideas, also just reach out. So one person reached out to us and said, I like what you guys do. I think you should have a broader audience. I'm gonna start a Medium for you all. What do you think? And we were like, Godspeed. And now she's running this incredible Medium series, right? So I should post this on the slide somewhere. So if you have ideas, it's a very junior people driven initiative. A lot of our stuff is like some person who's relatively junior came up with an idea and they were like, I'm going to do this. And we were like, let us know how we can support you. So if you want to do that, absolutely go ahead.
Perfect, thanks. I guess I just have one last question. I know we're very close to the end of the hour. I think your achievements by the time you graduated from your PhD are like, really impressive on so many different fronts. If you have like a bit of advice to give to our own students to like, achieve a fraction of what you have done, what would that be?
I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah. So it's interesting to me that you say that and that others have said that. So I actually like really, really struggled through undergrad, absolutely. Through the first 2 years of grad school, I really, really struggled. I didn't publish that much. I didn't feel like I belonged. I had many conversations with my advisor about potentially dropping out. And it wasn't like, oh, I might drop it. Like, it was genuinely like, what am I even doing here? I don't think that the kind of work that I do it was all the sort of the usual things that you feel in grad school where you're like, oh, I don't know what I'm doing. Everyone else knows more than me, blah, blah, blah. But also I just felt like the stuff that I really cared about, I didn't necessarily see it reflected in my communities. I really valued the technical work that was happening. And then I really valued what was happening in sociology, but I knew I wasn't a sociologist. I didn't know about social work at the time. I'm sure if I had known about social work, I would have felt even more sad, right? And so it just felt like I didn't quite see a senior researcher that I was like that person. They've made it, and so I can make it too. And it took a really big leap of faith. I remember having a very distinct conversation with my advisor where I sort of committed. I said, I can do the typical sort of networks type stuff that he does, that I like enough that I could do, and I could get a PhD that way. I felt like a PhD is a really long time to do something that you don't feel super passionate about. And so I remember telling him, I want to do this other thing. At the time, MD4SG was like a small reading. It's like 10 people. It was 8 people. It was an 8 people reading group, but it was taking up all of my time. And I remember telling him, this really matters to me. And I just want to know what's out there. And I want to know what kind of contributions folks like myself can make to spaces where we can improve people's lives, and it's going to take me a while. Probably I'm not going to do as well in my PhD. It might take me longer to graduate. We just like talk through it. And I made a very conscious decision to do that. And it ended up being the best decision, in large part because I was just much happier because I was doing something that I really cared about. And I felt like I was, as a result, I was engaging with people that also felt the same way. And I think creating that sense of like community really, really makes a huge difference, especially among other junior scholars. I think, as you become more senior, you have more security. So I think it's still useful, but I think when you're junior, it's so useful. So that was the first thing. But the second thing is also, if you really like what you're doing, then you just do better work, and so then probably you'll get a better job that way. That was the other thing that I didn't realize that I was just sort of like a PhD is a really long time to do something that you only like enough and not, you know, really passionately. So that's my advice. Do the thing that you really, really like.
Very good advice. Thank you so much, Rediet. I guess this is the end of our seminar. Let's thank Rediet again so much. I'm clapping on my own. Sorry, I'm sure everyone is at home. Thanks so much for your time. The recording is going to be available online. Thank you for letting us do that.
Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, I'll move over to the other Zoom then for the Zoom.
Sounds